An American intelligence officer just threw an Allied officer out of a classified briefing. Not quietly, not diplomatically. He pointed at the door in front of a room full of senior staff and said the words that would echo through classified reports for the next decade. "This is not your briefing." The Australian liaison officer, a man who had spent months bleeding intelligence from the jungle that the Americans couldn't get themselves, stood up, collected his notes, and walked out without a word. And you know what happened the following morning? The intelligence he had been gathering, the intercepts, the pattern analysis, the precise enemy coordinates that American assets couldn't produce, all of it was no longer flowing to the Combined Operations Center at Long Bin. And 3 weeks later, American forces walked blind into a position that the Australians had already mapped from the inside. This story has never been told in full. The ejection incident itself spent decades buried in inter-allied communications and classified liaison reports. But what it represented, the moment the philosophical collision between two entirely different approaches to intelligence finally became personal, tells you more about why the Vietnam War unraveled the way it did than any battlefield narrative you've ever heard. Because this wasn't a story about tactical failure. It was a story about institutional arrogance colliding with operational truth. And the truth was sitting in an Australian radio intercept station in Nui Dat, speaking in a language Long Bin didn't want to hear. Stay with me. To understand the moment the door swung shut on an Australian liaison officer, you have to first understand the architecture of intelligence in Vietnam. Not the broad strokes, but the actual machinery, the systems, the rivalries, the institutional loyalties that shaped how information moved or didn't move through the Allied command structure. By 1967, American military intelligence in Vietnam had grown into one of the most elaborate collection and analysis apparatuses ever assembled in a war zone. The 525th Military Intelligence Group sat at the apex of the structure at Tan Son Nhut, commanding counterintelligence, human intelligence collection, interrogation operations, and coordination with the Republic of Vietnam's military security services. The Army Security Agency had deployed roughly 1/5 of its total 30,000-man strength to Southeast Asia, operating under the cover name Radio Research and conducting signals interception from both ground stations and purpose-equipped aircraft. The MACVJ-2, the Intelligence Directorate of Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, exercised general staff supervision over all of these assets, producing the classified intelligence products that shaped everything from daily operational orders to the national estimates that landed on the President's desk in Washington. On paper, it was formidable. In practice, there was a flaw built into the architecture from the beginning, a flaw that CIA analyst Sam Adams would spend years attempting to expose, and that a small Australian signals troop in Phuoc Toi province would demonstrate with quiet, devastating precision. The flaw was not technical. The Americans had superb collection assets. The flaw was institutional. The intelligence that MACVJ-2 produced was not simply a reflection of what had been collected. It was a reflection of what senior commanders needed the intelligence to say. This distinction between intelligence as analysis and intelligence as justification would define the entire American experience in Vietnam, and it would make the contributions of 547 Signal Troop and the Australian Defence Signals Division liaison officers stationed with American commands simultaneously indispensable and unwelcome. The order of battle controversy is the clearest window into this institutional pathology. From at least 1965, MACV had been producing estimates of Viet Cong's strength that CIA analysts found deeply implausible. Sam Adams, working out of CIA headquarters in Virginia, had pored through thousands of captured enemy documents, village-level records, provincial party reports, logistics manifests, and arrived at a figure for total communist strength in South Vietnam that was approximately double what MACV was publishing. When he brought this to MACV's attention, the response was not analytical disagreement. It was institutional resistance. Senior MACV intelligence officers acknowledged privately, in conversations that would surface decades later in depositions and testimony, that their hands were tied. The command had established a ceiling for enemy strength estimates. 300,000 was the number that political imperatives demanded, and no amount of field intelligence was going to push that ceiling higher. A smaller enemy force meant the strategy of attrition was working. A larger enemy force meant it was not. The careers of generals, the credibility of an administration, the narrative of a war all depended on keeping that number where it was. The intelligence followed the policy, not the other way around. The Australians, watching this from their position in Phuoc Toi province, understood what was happening in a way that was almost clinical. Their own intelligence operation had been built on entirely different foundations. When Australia deployed 547 Signal Troop to Nui Dat in June of 1966, its initial mandate was straightforward: serve as a conduit for top-secret signals intelligence products flowing from the American headquarters at Long Bin down to the 1st Australian Task Force. The Australians would receive the finished American product and pass it on. That was the arrangement. Within months, the arrangement had become something else entirely. 547 Signal Troop had begun generating its own intelligence. Using airborne radio direction finding equipment mounted in Cessna aircraft, equipment that their officer commanding described as probably the single most important intelligence tool in the province, the troop was intercept-fixing the positions of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army radio transmitters with an accuracy that American systems operating at regional scale could not match. The difference was not technology, it was focus. The troop was working a defined tactical area, building up a detailed understanding of enemy communications patterns over months of continuous collection. They knew which net was the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion's command element. They knew when that net went silent, what it usually meant. They knew the difference between administrative traffic and operational coordination, and they could read the rhythm of the enemy's preparations in the way a fisherman reads weather in the color of water. The commander of the 1st Australian Task Force regarded the troop as his most valuable source of intelligence. That assessment was not hyperbole. At Long Tan, in August 1966, signals intelligence about enemy movement in the rubber plantation preceded the contact that would see 108 Australian soldiers fight off more than 2,000 Viet Cong. The intelligence had been there. The question, as it always was in Vietnam, was whether it would be used. Before we go further, we need to spend a moment with the physical reality of what 547 Signal Troop was doing, because without that foundation, the significance of what was shut out of that briefing room doesn't land with its full weight. The troop was a small unit by any measure. Initially 15 men when it deployed to Nui Dat in June 1966, growing to 35 by the end of 1967. They operated out of a facility they called the set room, a collection of radio intercept positions and direction-finding equipment that would have looked, to an uninformed observer, like a reasonably well-equipped communications workshop. What was happening inside it was something closer to a sustained act of institutional penetration. The troop's operators were intercepting Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army radio traffic continuously, not periodically, not on a mission basis, but every hour of every day. They were building a model of enemy communications patterns in Vuoc Toi and adjacent areas that grew more accurate and more operationally useful with every week that passed. They knew the call signs. They knew the operators by the way they handled their Morse keys, a technique called radio fingerprinting that allowed a skilled intercept analyst to identify a specific individual on a specific radio from hundreds of kilometers away. They knew the rhythms of the enemy's administrative traffic and could feel when those rhythms changed. When a formation was preparing to move, there was a change in the pattern of communications, more traffic on certain nets, less on others, specific types of coordination messages that preceded major operations the way a particular arrangement of clouds precedes rain, to someone who has spent years reading a particular sky. The troop's cryptanalysts and linguists were reading that sky with extraordinary precision. They were translating specific intercepted messages in real time, recovering coordinates, identifying unit designations, and passing the product directly to the task force's intelligence staff within hours of collection. When Corporal Adrian Bishop deciphered an intercepted Viet Cong message in 1969 that revealed a 274th Regiment element was planning a major attack on a Thai Army position and that casualties were to be evacuated to the Mae Tao Mountains, the resulting ambush operation killed 234 enemy soldiers in 4 days. This was the machinery that was producing the intelligence the American briefing officer didn't want discussed. The structural friction between Australian and American intelligence operations grew from several distinct sources, each of which compounded the others in ways that made resolution progressively harder. The first source was philosophical. American intelligence doctrine in the 1960s operated on a fundamentally quantitative model. The unit of success was the metric: body count, artillery rounds fired, kilometers of jungle cleared, numbers of enemy communication nodes identified and targeted. Every piece of intelligence was ultimately in service of a number that could be reported up the chain and contribute to the aggregate statistical picture that told Washington the strategy was working. The Australians approached intelligence from a different tradition, shaped by the Malayan emergency and the Indonesian confrontation, by years of operating in environments where the enemy had no conventional order of battle and where winning meant understanding behavior patterns and community relationships rather than simply counting bodies. Australian intelligence was qualitative. It was about comprehension before action rather than collection to justify action already decided. When 547 Signal Troop provided an intercept to Australian Task Force headquarters, the question it answered was not, "How many have we killed today?" but, "What is the enemy planning, and where will they be vulnerable?" These were not compatible frameworks, and they produced intelligence products that looked structurally different and could not be easily integrated into the American system. The second source of friction was the order of battle problem itself. By 1967, as the MACV-CIA dispute over enemy strength was reaching its most intense phase, the Australians had a cleaner picture of Viet Cong strength in their operational area than American estimates would officially acknowledge. 547 signal troop intercepts, combined with SAS long-range reconnaissance patrols, had mapped the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion's operational patterns with enough resolution to allow the task force to predict unit movements before they occurred. This was intelligence of a different category from what MACV was producing for Third Corps, and it implied an enemy that was not being attrited into irrelevance. In the province of Phuoc Tuy, enemy strength was not declining on the trajectory American doctrine required. It was adapting. The Viet Cong were changing their communications protocols, relocating their command elements, shifting supply routes. These were the behaviors of an enemy that was learning, not an enemy that was losing. Australian reports that reflected this reality were not welcome additions to the American intelligence picture. They were complications. The third source of friction was command. The 1st Australian Task Force had its own tactical area of responsibility and its own chain of command that ran back to Canberra, rather than through MACV's hierarchy in Saigon. Australian forces were under operational coordination with the 2nd Field Force Vietnam at Long Binh, not under operational control. The distinction mattered enormously. Operational control means you can issue orders. Operational coordination means you share information and avoid stepping on each other's feet. The Americans at Long Binh never fully accepted this distinction. Senior American officers regularly attempted to task Australian forces for missions outside Phuoc Tuy province, to integrate Australian intelligence assets into American collection plans, to redirect the focus of 547 signal troops collection priorities toward American operational needs rather than Australian tactical requirements. The Australians declined, politely and repeatedly, citing the military working arrangement that explicitly preserved Australian command independence. Each refusal deepened the resentment. Into this environment of accumulated institutional tension, the Combined Operations Center at Long Binh served as one of the primary venues where American and Australian intelligence officers were required to work side by side. These were facilities where signals, intelligence, human intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and captured document analysis were integrated into the operational picture that 2nd Field Force used to plan and direct major operations. For Australian liaison officers assigned to these centers, the experience was an education in the gap between the intelligence picture the Americans were building and the intelligence picture that existed on the ground. American intelligence briefings at these combined centers followed a predictable format. Maps covered in enemy unit designations, most of them derived from American collection sources, body count tallies organized by sector, enemy activity assessments calibrated against the progress metrics that the strategy of attrition demanded. The numbers were coherent, they were internally consistent, and they bore a relationship to the actual operational environment in Phuoc Tuy that Australian officers working from 547 signal troop intercepts and SAS reconnaissance reports found increasingly difficult to square. The specific dynamic that built toward the ejection incident unfolded over months rather than days. Australian liaison officers at Long Binh had begun, carefully and through appropriate channels, raising questions about the accuracy of enemy strength assessments for areas adjacent to Phuoc Tuy, not contradicting the American picture directly, not challenging command authority, simply noting in the measured language of professional intelligence officers, that Australian collection sources were producing figures that didn't align with the official estimates, and that the discrepancies had operational implications. The response from American intelligence officers varied. Some were genuinely interested. A few quietly agreed that the official numbers were political products rather than analytical ones, but the institutional weight pressed in one direction only. MACV had established its picture. Corps-level intelligence products flowed from that picture. Anyone who challenged the picture was not contributing to the mission. They were complicating it. The liaison officer who ended up on the wrong side of the door had been doing exactly what a competent intelligence professional was supposed to do. He had been cross-referencing Australian intercept data with the operational assessments being briefed at Long Bin and noting the discrepancies aloud. In a different institutional culture, this would have been welcomed as critical thinking. In the culture that had developed around the MACV intelligence system by 1967 and 1968, it was something closer to insubordination. The briefings being conducted at that combined operations center reflected months of careful curation. The enemy order of battle had been assembled to support an attrition strategy that required declining enemy strength. The body count metrics supported a narrative of progress. Any piece of intelligence that cut against this architecture was not simply wrong, it was dangerous. It threatened the coherence of the story that American commanders were telling their superiors, and that their superiors were telling the administration, and that the administration was using to maintain domestic support for the war. The stakes of intelligence integrity were not abstract. They ran in an unbroken line from the patrol briefings at Long Bin to the Oval Office. The Australian liaison officer, with his SAS reconnaissance reports and 547 signal troop intercepts, and his habit of asking why the numbers didn't match, was pulling on a thread that no one in that room could afford to unravel. The ejection, when it came, was the institutional pressure made personal. "This is not your briefing." 6 words that meant, in the language beneath the language, "Your intelligence doesn't belong in this picture. Your questions are not welcome here. The war we are fighting does not have room for the war you are describing." What happened in the weeks following the incident illuminated the cost of that institutional closure with a clarity that no after-action report would fully capture. But first, it is worth dwelling on what the ejected officer actually represented, because the man who walked out of that briefing room was not simply one liaison officer with a different set of maps. He was the living endpoint of a chain of collection and analysis that stretched back through the SAS patrols. The 547 signal troop intercept positions, the Aboriginal trackers reading the jungle by methods that had no Western equivalent, and the entire philosophical tradition of Australian counterinsurgency that the Malayan emergency had forged and Borneo had refined. When he walked out that door, the room lost all of that. Not just his folder of intelligence products, but the methodology and the honesty behind them. The Americans in that room kept their briefing. They kept their maps with their neat unit designations and their body count tallies and their trajectory lines showing enemy attrition bending toward the crossover point where Viet Cong losses would exceed their ability to recruit. It was a beautiful picture, constructed with institutional care, and it was wrong in its foundations in ways that would take another 18 months and a national shock called Tet to fully demonstrate. The first Australian task force and its intelligence apparatus at Nui Dat did not stop collecting. 547 signal troop, continued its intercept operations. SAS patrols continued their long-range reconnaissance into the Maytao complex and the Hot Dick secret zone. The intelligence continued to accumulate. What changed was the flow. The informal channels through which Australian collection had been contributing to the broader Allied picture, quietly, without formal acknowledgement, through the professional relationships that liaison officers built over months of working alongside their American counterparts, were disrupted, not severed entirely. But the trust that makes Allied intelligence sharing work at the operational level, the willingness of one professional to take another's product seriously, even when it complicates the picture, had been damaged. The operational consequences were visible in the pattern of American operations in the period. Units moving through areas adjacent to Poak Tui were operating from intelligence pictures that had significant gaps where Australian collection would have filled them. Enemy units that 547 Signal Troop could track through their communication signatures were navigating freely in areas where American patrols were conducting sweep operations. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion and the North Vietnamese regular formations moving through the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone were more sophisticated in their movement patterns than American intelligence acknowledged, and the price of that gap between assessment and reality was paid in American casualties. The parallel contrast with Australian operations in the same period is instructive. Within Phuoc Thai Province, where the task force maintained full control over its intelligence apparatus and acted directly on 547 Signal Troop products, operations were achieving results that American commanders in adjacent areas found difficult to explain. The SAS-driven ambush operations, positioned on routes identified by intercept analysis, were producing kill ratios that stood in stark contrast to American averages. Operation Marsden in 1969 would become perhaps the clearest example of what this intelligence-driven approach could achieve. An operation that located a massive Viet Cong supply cache and headquarters complex in the Maytao Mountains by building up a picture over weeks through patient collection rather than through the rapid sweep and assess methodology American doctrine preferred. When Australian forces finally moved on the complex, they found weapons sufficient to equip 2 full battalions, medical supplies for a field hospital, and intelligence documents that illuminated the Viet Cong command structure throughout the region. The operation devastated the D445 battalion's operational capacity for months. This was the intelligence architecture that was shut out of the Long Bin briefing room, not because it was producing poor results, because it was producing good ones, and good results from an Allied approach that contradicted American doctrine were arguably more threatening to the institutional consensus than poor results would have been. If Australian methods were simply less effective, they could be dismissed. If they were demonstrably more effective, they raised questions about American methods that no one in command was prepared to answer. The order of battle controversy provides the intellectual framework for understanding why the ejection incident was not an isolated act of interpersonal friction, but the visible surface of a much deeper institutional conflict. Sam Adams, the CIA analyst who had spent years documenting MACV's systematic manipulation of enemy strength figures, was fighting the same battle through civilian intelligence channels that the Australian liaison officer was fighting through military ones. The enemy was more numerous, more resilient, and more capable than the official picture acknowledged. The intelligence existed to prove it, and the institutions with the power to change the picture had too much invested in the existing narrative to allow the change. Adams eventually testified, with the precision of a man who had spent years building an evidentiary case, that Massey's insistence on holding the enemy order of battle below 300,000 was an artificial position dictated by political considerations rather than analysis. Officers who had worked in MACV's intelligence sections confirmed in deposition that the command had known the true numbers were higher and had suppressed them anyway. The head of MACV's Order of Battle section told a CIA counterpart directly that his hands were tied, that there was a command position, and that no analytical evidence was going to move it. When the Tet Offensive arrived in January 1968, it arrived with forces that had not appeared in the official enemy strength estimates. The gap between the intelligence picture and the operational reality was no longer a matter of professional disagreement. It was bodies in the streets of Saigon and Hue, and 30 provincial capitals simultaneously. The Australians had been living with that gap longer than most. By the time Tet exposed the American intelligence system's institutional failures to the world, 547 Signal Troop had been producing intercepts that painted a more accurate picture of enemy capability for nearly 2 years. The Australian approach, characterized by deep local knowledge, continuous collection, and analysis untethered from command-imposed ceilings, was producing a picture that was, in its essential outlines, closer to the truth. And the truth was uncomfortable. The enemy was not being attrited. It was adapting, and adapting enemies were exactly what a strategy of attrition could not accommodate. The aftermath of the ejection incident played out in the way that institutional conflicts in Allied command structures always do, through diplomatic channels, through careful language, through official communications that described what had happened in ways that both parties could live with. The Australians made it clear, through their liaison office in Saigon and through the command relationship between Headquarters, Australian Force Vietnam, and 2nd Field Force, that the conduct of Australian intelligence liaison officers was a matter for Australian command authority. They were professionals, operating under Australian doctrine and reporting to Australian commanders. They were not subordinate to the whims of American intelligence section heads, however senior. The Americans, for their part, did not formally acknowledge that anything had gone wrong. The record does not contain a letter of apology. It contains, instead, the kind of studied silence that bureaucracies deploy when an incident is too embarrassing to address and too significant to simply forget. What changed in practical terms was the formalization of some intelligence sharing arrangements that had previously operated through informal channels. The value of 547 Signal Troops collection had been visible to American commanders who were willing to look past the institutional frictions. General Bruce Palmer, commanding 2nd Field Force, had insisted on sending an American liaison officer to the troop specifically because he recognized the accuracy of their intercepts exceeded what his own organization was producing. That professional recognition created pathways for intelligence sharing that the briefing room incident could damage but not entirely destroy. The troop continued to operate in direct support of both the Australian Task Force and American units, whose commanders had the wit to value what was being offered. But the briefing room incident left its mark on the character of the relationship in ways that are difficult to quantify and impossible to ignore. Trust between intelligence organizations is not a structural feature. It is a personal and institutional posture, the willingness to take another organization's product seriously, to be changed by it, to allow it to complicate your picture in ways that might require you to change your plans. That willingness had been damaged. The Australians, who had been doing serious work in silence, producing collection of genuine quality in a theater where genuine quality was scarce, had been told, in front of a room full of witnesses, that their work wasn't welcome at the table. They absorbed that lesson. Some of them spent the rest of their tours producing intelligence that went primarily into Australian channels and reached American commanders only when there was a specific operational reason to share it. The legacy of the intelligence conflict extends far beyond the individual incident and the individual war. The institutional failures that produced the ejection moment, the corruption of intelligence by command preference, the suppression of inconvenient collection, the substitution of narrative management for analytical integrity, were not unique to Vietnam. They were documented, studied, and debated for decades in the aftermath of the war, and the conclusions reached were clear enough that American intelligence reform efforts in the 1970s and 1980s drew explicitly on the lessons of what had gone wrong. The Pike Committee hearings in Congress examined the intelligence community's performance in Vietnam, including the order of battle controversy, with a frankness that the institutions themselves had never applied to their own conduct. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which restructured American military command and intelligence relationships, was partly shaped by the recognition that the Vietnam-era MACV system had allowed command authority to contaminate analytical independence in ways that were operationally catastrophic. The Australian contribution to this story, the contribution that was shown the door, eventually received a measure of formal recognition. 547 signal troops work was credited with saving hundreds of Australian and American lives through early warning of imminent enemy operations. The troop was awarded the Republic of Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Palm in 2018, more than 4 decades after the last of its operators came home from Nui Dat. The citation acknowledged what the Combined Operations Center briefings had tried to deny, that Australian intelligence collection had provided capabilities that American systems could not match, and that this capability had been real and consequential and worth acknowledging. Late, but not entirely silent. The broader Australian contribution to the intelligence picture in Vietnam followed a similar arc, invisible during the war, partially acknowledged in the decades after, still not fully integrated into the public understanding of what happened in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy and the briefing rooms of Long Binh. The SAS long-range reconnaissance patrols, operating with the same patient methodology that characterized Australian operations across every domain, were producing human intelligence of a depth and reliability that American long-range reconnaissance units, constrained by their shorter patrol durations and more aggressive tasking, could not consistently match. The Aboriginal trackers embedded with SAS squadrons were reading the jungle in ways that no sensor array could replicate. The result was an intelligence picture that, within the boundaries of Phuoc Tuy province, was consistently closer to operational reality than anything the MACV-J2 was producing at the theater level. The contrast carries an irony that history has not quite finished digesting. The Americans, operating with the most extensive intelligence collection apparatus ever deployed in a counterinsurgency environment, were producing intelligence that was structurally shaped by political requirements. The Australians, operating with a fraction of that capability, a single signals troop, a single SAS squadron, infantry patrols working a confined tactical area, were producing intelligence that was structurally shaped by operational need. The first approach was well-funded, institutionally dominant, and wrong about the fundamental questions of the war. The second approach was marginal, perpetually underfunded relative to American assets, and right about the same questions. The man who was shown the door was carrying the right answers. The room he was shown out of was the room where those answers most needed to be heard. There is a final dimension to this story that lives in the space between the documentary record and the human experience of the people who were actually in those rooms. For the Australian liaison officers who spent their tours navigating the institutional politics of Long Bin and Saigon, the intelligence friction was not an abstraction. It was the daily reality of watching information you knew to be accurate get absorbed into a machine that was going to process it into something it needed it to be, rather than something it was. For the operators of 547 Signal Troop, sitting in their intercept rooms at Nui Dat with their headsets on and their direction-finding equipment tracking enemy transmitters through the jungle, the question of whether what they produced would be used honestly, used fully, used in ways that reflected what it actually showed, was not academic. It was the question that made the work meaningful or hollow. The intelligence they produced was accurate. The pattern of life analysis they conducted on enemy communications was sophisticated. The early warnings they generated of imminent attacks were validated repeatedly by events. And still, in the parallel world of the Combined Operations Center at Long Bin, there were moments when the picture they were building was unwelcome, when the conclusions it implied were inconvenient, when the officer carrying it to the briefing table was pointed at the door. Those moments are not simply episodes of institutional dysfunction in a war that produced many such episodes. They are evidence of a systematic failure of the kind that Sam Adams spent his career documenting and that the post-war assessments eventually confirmed. When intelligence systems serve institutional needs rather than operational truth, the people paying the price are not the officers in the briefing rooms. They are the soldiers in the jungle, moving on the basis of a picture that the intelligence system has shaped to reflect what it needed to be true rather than what the evidence showed. Vietnam produced casualties of many kinds. Among them were the casualties produced by the gap between what 547 Signal Troop was intercepting and what MACV was briefing. Among them were the soldiers who walked into positions that Australian intelligence had mapped and whose coordinates never made it into the right hands because the liaison officer carrying them had been shown the door. There is a particular bitterness in considering how that gap might have been closed. The information existed. The collection capability existed. The analytical expertise to turn raw intercepts into actionable intelligence existed. Sitting in a small troop at Nui Dat, with headsets on and direction-finding aerials sweeping the jungle airspace. What did not exist was the institutional willingness to take it seriously, to allow the picture to be complicated, to accept that a smaller ally might be seeing something that the dominant force was missing, to treat intelligence as a mirror for reality rather than a brush for painting the picture that the command needed. This willingness is not a function of resources or technology. It is a function of institutional character. And institutional character is formed over decades, shaped by incentive structures and leadership examples, and the accumulated lessons of how success and failure are defined and rewarded. The American military in Vietnam had shaped its institutional character around metrics and firepower and the doctrine of overwhelming force. It had rewarded officers who produced good numbers and punished those who complicated the picture. It had built an intelligence system in the image of that character, one that was very good at collecting and not very good at seeing. The Australians had built their institutional character around a different set of experiences and a different definition of success. They were very good at seeing, and they were shown the door. This is not your briefing. 6 words that meant the war would continue to be fought on a false picture. 6 words that meant the intelligence that could have changed outcomes would continue to flow into channels that wouldn't use it. 6 words that, in the particular resonance of that moment, in a combined operations center at Long Binh, encapsulated everything that the Vietnam War did wrong at the level of institutional character, and everything that the Australian approach, patient and precise and stubbornly honest about what the jungle was actually saying, did right. The door swung shut. The war continued. The intelligence picture remained what the command needed it to be, and the small Australian signals troop in Nui Dat kept its headsets on, kept its Cessnas flying their direction-finding routes over the jungle canopy, and kept producing a picture of the war that was, in its essential outlines, true. Nobody in a position of American command authority would formally acknowledge that for decades. But the men who were ambushed, the men who were extracted, the men who came home, they knew which picture had kept them alive. It was never the one on the wall at Long Binh.